Good afternoon, everybody. This is the last session of the Partners Workshop. I hope you're all feeling energised and elated and maybe a little bit tired like I am. But we're very pleased to be here. It's been a big build-up, a lot of preparation. So for us in the AWP team, it's really, really exciting to get to this point in the day. So I'm going to be introducing this topic of development outcomes. I'm going to be setting the scene for a discussion which will explore this important and admittedly sometimes difficult concept. So we've actually opted to do this as a session in plenary because it contains some key updates on AWP's thinking on this issue, which we wanted to give partners an opportunity to hear about firsthand and also to ask any questions. As we've heard a lot over the last 2 days as a partnership, we need to work together, and we need to work together especially through any significant change. So thanks for your engagement on this. I thought I might kick us off just by offering a few thoughts on this concept of development outcomes based on my experience of pursuing these through international development in my career in many different contexts and countries and in a lot of different sectors as well. So I thought I'd just break it down into 3 ideas. The first of these ideas that are sort of nested within inside this concept of development outcomes in my brain, at least, is the importance of seeing people. So we've all heard a lot about this already over the last couple of days, but I think it's really important to just take note of that as a really key concept for us all to recognise. I don't need to tell anyone within this room that managing water is really complex. There's so many engineering questions in managing water through its natural cycles and human uses: water supply, irrigation, environmental flows, sanitation, flood control, just to name a few. The hydrological science underpinning all this deals with rivers and surface water and groundwater and all their interactions with soil and air and vegetation and food systems and human settlements. It's really complex stuff. And these aspects are undoubtedly critical, but they're also working very closely hand in hand with social and political drivers. Those of you that attended the Thinking and Working Politically training on day 1 will have a very fresh perspective on this, but power over the life-giving resource of water is subject to very human trade-offs, politics and negotiations, and underpinned by a lot of assumptions about who needs it, for what purpose, and whose needs are priority when water is scarce. So this, I think, is why GEDSI, or Gender, Disability and Social Inclusion, is becoming more of a prominent feature in our work here at AWP. It's really about power and about whose voices get heard. So this idea of leaving no one behind is really important in fully understanding the socio-political systems that support and give meaning to our work in AWP. Thinking through these aspects is part and parcel of being prepared to identify and achieve development outcomes, and each context offers its own special mix of factors. This is an idea that came out really strongly in our GEDSI session earlier today. So this leads me to the second idea, which I see nested inside the concept of development impact, and that's the idea of change. So now that we can see the people, the actors in the system, we can move into new terrain. And the fundamental idea here is that work we do in a development context will result in a change, and hopefully that change is a positive change. So we need to track the action, which is the output, through to the change we want to see, which is the outcome. AWP has historically been really good at tracking outputs. As an example, we trained 50 men and 50 women on new water accounting tools. And the output there was 50 men and 50 women were trained to use new water accounting tools. Or another example, we supported the development of a basin plan. And the output here is a completed basin plan. The challenge that we have before us is that outputs aren't enough. We can't stop here at doing the training or completing the basin plan because it doesn't tell us enough about the development change. What we really want to know is whether the officers trained applied the new water accounting tools, leading to formal adoption of the practice. And then accounting accuracy is increased by 30% or something. Or whether the completed basin plan was adopted by the Basin Management Committee, leading to implementation guidelines and ultimately positive change for communities. For development impacts, we need to ascribe meaning, which is all about the development context. The meaning of our actions gives us the so what. What does this mean? And this leads us to an understanding of how actions or outputs lead to the positive change that we want to see, or the outcomes. So my third and last idea that I wanted to just draw out as we go into this session is the idea of data. This has come up again a lot through this workshop over the 2 days. And this is actually related to the extremely good question of, so how do we know when we're on the right track? Obviously, sometimes this is much easier than others, and linear cause and effect thinking can help, but will only get us so far. The more complex the environment and the change that we're hoping to support, the more we need to accept that our contribution will only be a very small part of an overall picture. This is a great challenge for us in the development sector. And when we add uncertainty of climate change and increased disasters, as we've seen so awfully in Australia over the last week or so, this challenge becomes even greater. So I'm just going to flick a slide up here. Many of you will know this already. This is the Cynefin framework, which is a basic tool in complexity thinking, which helps us to analyse different types of problems, including development problems. But I'm using it here just to highlight the behavioural prompts that it gives us. When we move away from that sort of simple and complicated quadrants, so that's anything really involving human behaviour, we start to need more and richer and different sources of information. So I think this is where partnerships actually become really, really crucial. And I've seen this throughout my career, and I've seen it here in our work in AWP as well. It's a shift in thinking that puts importance on the quality of relationships in achieving lasting and sustainable development outcomes. As Bob McMullen said last night, the potential in these partnerships is something that really makes AWP quite unique. So there are my 3 points: people, change, and data. And this is the challenge that we have before us. So to get deeper into these ideas, I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers. So first of all, we have Peter O'Connor, who's the Director of the Water Security Section, and he'll be speaking about building deep and trusted relationships with partner governments and other stakeholders on the ground for development outcomes. Dave Hebelthwaite, who'll be joining us online from SUVA, is the Water Security and Governance Coordinator at SPC. And his topic will be 1 step forwards, 2 steps back, assessing the impacts of disasters on Pacific development goals. And our final speaker will be our very own Neil Forster, who's a monitoring and evaluation specialist with AWP. And he'll be giving an introduction to AWP's proposed new performance management system. So now I'll hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Sarah. That was the perfect introduction to what I'm going to say. I would have thought you might think we colluded, but we didn't. But thank you very much for that. So good afternoon, everybody. One thing that I've seemed to have noticed over the last couple of days in the sessions that I've attended in this workshop, there's been a lot of people talking about partnership, which is pretty natural, given it's a partnerships workshop, but a lot of people talking about relationships as well. And that's good. All I can say to you now, I'm going to give you the same message. So I'm going to repeat it more again about relationships. But I'm hoping that I can frame it in a slightly different way, hopefully a little bit of an interesting way. So the key message of my presentation today is that the most important element of achieving sustainable development outcomes is not the transfer of technology or the transfer of systems. It's not the building of capacity to operate those systems. nor is it the introduction of new legislation or regulatory frameworks. It's very simply that we forge really good trusting relationships prior to, during, and after transferring the technology or implementing the systems. So it's all about relationships. Those relationships, they happen on a number of levels, certainly in the sort of work that we do, which is overseas development work. These relationships happen at the diplomatic level. They happen at the, and that's very much a responsibility for DFAT to support AWP partners and AWP to support AWP partners at the diplomatic level. They happen at the professional level, the counterpart level, which is the level that many of you partners will work at, the relationships you have with your counterpart agencies. But they also happen, and these are the most important ones, at the stakeholder level, and that's everything beneath. And that's a lot of levels and a lot of different stakeholders. And I would argue that these are the most important relationships to ensure the success of development outcomes in the sort of work that we do and that we ask you to do overseas as well. Our success in forging and managing these sorts of relationships, it starts from the very beginning of a project prior to the concept stage. And it's what it's all about. The way I think of it, it's about how we frame a project. Everything we do in development should start with a really simple, clear proposition or a very simple, clear objective. And it's, what are we doing that will improve the lives of girls, boys, men, women, communities? That's the concept, that's the idea, the objective that we start with. But we often don't do that. Let me give you a real world example of this, a project I was associated with and which I think was very wrongly framed. And these projects like this are often wrongly framed. This was a road infrastructure project in quite a large road infrastructure project in a very poor country and in quite a remote area of a poor country. It was connecting a provincial capital, very small provincial capital, to a range of communities along about 150 kilometres of coast moving into hinterland. The provincial capital was the only port into this region. And it was a significant engineering project. There was something like 12 quite large bridges, as well as lots of smaller bridges as well. So given that this was a project that was implemented by a large international agency and it was via a concessional loan, it was seen as a very major engineering project for this country, which it was, and a very capable, very experienced engineer was put in charge of it. And that's where the problem started. And it wasn't that an engineer was put in charge of it, but from the start, it was framed as an engineering project. And that's intuitive. It was a road project, so it's an engineering project. But in my view, road projects are not first and most engineering projects. We build roads because not to celebrate engineering. That's art. That is not development. Development is not about building roads for the sake of building roads. Development is, building roads in development, it's about connecting communities. So it's about changing the relationships within and between those communities. It's about bringing in new ideas, new ways of doing things. That's what a road project is all about. Definitely not an engineering project. Relationships are changed from the increased flow of ideas, new flow of people, new cultures and that coming in. And the changes in a very poor country can be very revolutionary, very dramatic and very impactful. And they can be very positive in many ways, but they can also be very negative in many ways. Now, if you look at in Australia, a new road project, for example, it won't be that impactful. It will have some positive benefits, but we're an extremely high developed country. We don't often recognise how complex and developed we are. But when the poorer the country, the more significant, the more far-reaching and the more revolutionary the changes of introducing this infrastructure are. So, a road project is not really an engineering project at all. A road project is first and foremost the start of a very complex program of socio-economic change. And that's the way it should be framed, right from the start. We're not building a road, we're going to make some dramatic changes to this society and to the economy and to the people. That's the way we've got to frame it. Of course, the international agency that was financing and building this road, I mean, they're not stupid people. They understood there would be social impacts. And that's how I came to be involved. The Australian Aid Program was asked to, invited to do a supplementary program that was grant funded, not loan funded, to sort of look at the social impacts and try and do something about them, monitor them and that sort of thing. Monitor them. But it was almost an afterthought, and our program had no control whatsoever over the engineering side of the project. It's a common mistake we still make in development programming. We don't have enough of the socio-economic side of the program controlling the engineering side of it. In this case, I mean, it was quite disastrous. Some of the immediate impacts were, and this was just during the construction phase, it reopened some old customary land issues that had sort of died down. So we had communities at conflict with each other. We had communities at conflict with, in conflict with the road builders. A couple of hundred foreign workers were brought in. It created a market for prostitution. I'm sure prostitution happened in that country beforehand, but not on the scale and the nature of this, of having hundreds of people come in. The conflict with the road builders got quite bad, and equipment was destroyed. It was pretty nasty. Probably the best stakeholder relationship that the head of the project had was with the local police, because he only saw this as a security issue and these people as criminals. He didn't really see the impact that his road was having on this society. And this is only during the construction phase as well. And I have to say the early to mid-construction phase. In the end, he was removed and somebody else was put in above the engineering and the sort of and the other parts of the project. But and it wasn't the project leader's fault. It was the head office's fault. They were the ones that framed this from the start as really just an engineering project. So as I say, that's a very extreme example. The reason I haven't used a water example is because I don't know any water examples that are that bad. Certainly not from AWP. But I mean, but the lesson for us is that, you know, if we build a dam, we're not building it to admire the engineering. I mean, the engineering is pretty amazing, but as I said, it's not an art project. We're building the dam because it's going to change the lives of farmers and industry and communities within the catchment or area of that dam. Even smaller projects that improve water management and waste and sanitation services can have significant socio-economic impacts on smaller communities, particularly in very poor countries that haven't had these services before. Sorry, I'll just have a glass of water in my mouth, sorry, to dry up. Smaller projects even really small projects can have substantial impacts on organisations and the relationships within and between organisations. If you're working in a Ministry of Water or something like that, the work you're doing, it will not just impact the team you're working with, but it's likely to impact the broader organisation and partner agencies that that organisation works with, and stakeholders within a sort of, you know, a couple of concentric circles of that agency. So how do we think through the framing of say, a water-related project? Conceptually, it's pretty simple. It's not that difficult at all. So let's say we have a project, we're working with the Ministry of Agriculture and Water Resources to develop a river basin management plan. But of course, the project is not to work with the ministry to develop a river basin management plan. The project is about trying to improve the access to water resources for the farmers and the communities within that river basin. So that's our starting point. It's not about working with the ministry. Working with the ministry, so we have over here the people that we want to help in the river basin. That's the true objective of this project. And we have over here the ministry. What we need to think of and people call it a theory of change. I call it a pathway of change. What is the pathway of change between our small little project on the River Basin Development Plan and how it's going to help these people, the farmers, the industry, the communities in this river basin? And once you start trying to plot out that pathway, it becomes very complex. As you would all know, the stakeholder pathways just start exploding. There's a range of government agencies. I mean, think of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Think of the Murray-Darling Basin, the number of stakeholders and that sort of thing. It's a jungle. But it helps to sort of plot through that. So by conceptualizing it and framing it in that way, what you will do is you'll put together a much more holistic concept of what actually needs to be done within this ministry and how it might impact. In doing so, you can also make a case for further funding. You know, like, okay, we're going to do this, but there are going to be some other impacts. Maybe we should even look at a community engagement package or something like that. Certainly from the point of view of DFAT, I mean, the first thing you'll say is, well, DFAT and AWP aren't funding us to do a vast program covering all these stakeholders. And that's correct. And I'm not suggesting that you need to design a project like that, but simply by going through that process of how is this going to help the communities in the river basin, you will start to think more about certainly the first concentric rings of stakeholders that you might need to deal with. And framing the project like that, certainly from DFAT's perspective and from AWPAC, I shouldn't speak for the AWPAC members, but I know many of them feel that that this sort of broader framing of the project is something that they like to see. So that brings me to my final point. So to help us through this pathway of change, this change pathway, to think through it, what we need to do is we need to think of the political economy of the water sector in that country in which we are working. So the value of this type of approach of thinking through these pathways of change is that it demands we think about the political economy. It demands we do a political economy analysis. It demands that we look at the historical and the social context in which the water sector in this country operates and the ministry that we're working with operates. We need, as part of that political economy analysis, to think of the ethnic context, the power hierarchies. Many of the countries we work in, there's a number of different cultural groups, and of course, the GEDSI context. What are the GEDSI implications if we want to do a well-rounded political economy analysis? So an understanding of the political economy of the water sector, it's absolutely essential to help you navigate your key counterparts and stakeholders and provide insights how you should manage those relationships. And it won't be relationships all along the chain from the ministry through to the farmer and the household, but it might go a little way outside of those. I think a lot of people here are probably experts on the political economy of the Murray-Darling Basin. And we all know what a jungle that is. I mean, imagine if you were sent from Holland or something to do some, pretty fundamental work in the Murray-Darling Basin. It'd be pretty hard to navigate through it. I don't think anybody here are experts on the political economy of the 50 Indo-Pacific countries in which we work. I know that there are some of you who are quite expert in the Mekong in particular, people such as John Dorr and I'm sure others. But anyway, that's a good way to think of it. Well, I'm navigating through another country's Murray-Darling Basin, and I don't really know that much about the history of the culture or anything. So after we work through this process, this pathway of change analysis, supported by a political economy analysis, supported by associated stakeholder and relationship mapping, then, and only then, are we in a position to really start thinking deeply about the technical aspects of that project, and then to really start thinking about the concept and the design. So that's it. That's all I've got to say. My last message is to go back to my original message, and that is The most important element of achieving sustainable development outcomes is the relationships that we forge prior to, during and after the technical side of that project. And the way we understand those relationships is thinking through the project from our little part of that project right through to the people, the men, women, boys, girls, farmers, industry on the ground that we're hoping to help. Thanks very much. Ciao.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for sharing with us the benefit of your almost 20 years experience working on the aid program. It's really great to hear some live examples. And you're right, we were quite complimentary in our messages, so that always checks out. Next, I would like to introduce Dave Hebel, who I think is online. There he is.
Hey, Sarah.
Hello, Dave. Good to see you.
Well, AWP.
Welcome to the AWP Partners Workshop. You had a cameo earlier and you were introduced then, but I'll just remind everybody, Dave is Suva-based and he's Water Security and Governance Coordinator of the Pacific Community, a regional organisation which has Australia as one of its members, and it's charged with supporting its 22 Pacific Island countries and territories to achieve their sustainable development goals through evidence-based actions and partnerships for resilience. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Sarah. Can I just check that you can see my my slides there, that I'm sharing my screen?
We can see your slide and you're in a little box as well.
I'm in a little box. Fantastic. Hey, thanks so much for having me. I really wish I was there in person. And yeah, hopefully we'll be getting a little bit back to normal soon. But yeah, thanks to AWP for the opportunity. Yeah, Sarah just introduced us, but I think we're probably the newest AWP member here, I'd imagine. I might be wrong, but we might even be the oldest AWP member in the oldest organisation. We're 75 years old this year. And as Sarah said, we work across the Pacific. We're governed by our 26 member countries and territories, and we support evidence-based action and resilient partnerships across the region. An example, perhaps, of that you might have seen around the Pacific is the Pacific Partnership for Atoll Water Security. It brings together atoll countries to share local solutions to common issues. And that's something that it's probably an example of our work that spans, as Peter said, it's about relationships, it's about long-term outcomes, and we do that by supporting practical solutions and the sharing of those. So the topic that I'm going to talk about today is a little different, it's a different angle. We often focus, as we should, on measuring progress, but in the Pacific, we're often trying to measure regression, and particularly this time of the year, cyclone season, but not just cyclone season. The Pacific, as you know, gets hit by disaster after disaster, and they can be perhaps small scale on a global scale, but for the region and Pacific Island countries, they can be profound. And often when we think of the water-related elements of disaster, we think of floods and droughts, and that's certainly something that Australia can relate to as well, particularly at the moment. But there's also the impact of extreme events on water and on sanitation. This diagram, this photograph is from The Guardian, from Cyclone Harold, which struck Vanuatu and the Pacific like within 1 month of the COVID lockdown. And often when you look at this photo, you can see different things. You can see, the impact on infrastructure, the impact on vegetation, on food security. When water practitioners look at this, you see the total destruction of rainwater harvesting infrastructure and the total destruction of sanitation facilities. And that's something that regularly hits the region, and it really sets our development goals and progress towards them back significantly. There's a publication that comes out every year, the World Risk Report, that ranks countries according to an index based on exposure, susceptibility, and adaptive capacity to disaster. And within the top 20, there's 6 Pacific Island countries. That's 6 of the 8 Pacific Island countries that actually have data. We know there's other countries there, which if they did collect data, they'd clearly be amongst that. So the Pacific is right up there in terms of the susceptibility to the risk of disaster. And if we look back through, this is PDN data on Desinventa, you can access it if you're interested. I think the link's there. In terms of total events recorded, on record, there's total events that actually are recorded in the Pacific. We see cyclones are the main ones. The blue ones here are hydrometeorological events. The brown ones are geological. Of course, there's a lot of conflation between those two times. In terms of lives lost, the largest is actually from earthquakes and volcanoes, believe it or not. Most of those volcano statistics are from the 1950s in PNG, but of course we've had a real reminder of the impact of volcanoes this year in January with Tonga. In terms of people directly affected, the water-related disasters really come to the fore, cyclones and floods, and of course there's a huge interaction between those. Houses destroyed, since records were collected, we've got close to 100,000 houses destroyed through cyclones and storm surges. Economic losses, around $3 trillion over that period. And again, mostly from cyclones. And if you look at the cyclone record, this is from 2007 to last year. These are category 5 cyclones. This is taken from the NOAA database. And we've had 2 direct hits as a 5 in that time, Cyclone Pam in 2015 and Winston in 2016. And they were record events for both Vanuatu and Fiji. If you broaden the scope and look at category 4 cyclones, it gets a little more crowded. Category 3, category 2, and basically category 1, all recorded over all of the times that cyclones recorded, it looks like that. And it's not just the South Pacific, this is Palau in the North Pacific. In that same period from 2007, there's been 2 category 5s, which is really unusual for Palau, in 2012 and 2013. So what are the impacts of these? So have a look at one way we measure impact, the impact on GDP. We know that Cyclone Winston, the category 5, was estimated to cost Fiji about 30% of its GDP. Pam was estimated at 65%. We know TC Evan, which was a much smaller system and didn't even make a direct hit on Samoa, but it still impacted mainly through flooding and storm surge, 45% of Samoa's GDP. So whilst these events are perhaps small to medium on a global scale, the impact on Pacific Island countries is profound. And perhaps a way to compare that would be looking at, well, impacts in Australia. The Millennium Drought, for example, is estimated to have cost Australia between 1 and 1.5% of its GDP. So really, when you're looking at these events that really impact in a large way on Pacific Island countries, we know that under climate change scenarios, cyclones are forecast to become more intense. So this really is a picture of the Pacific's coal-fired future. And everyone's really aware that this is something that we are going to need to be more and more prepared for. So how do disasters undermine sustainable development? So if you look at just one indicator, say GDP growth over time, and normally we expect to be progressing towards our development goals and GDP going up until perhaps a disaster hits. And we may have been heading towards a pretty optimistic path, but a disaster can adjust that path. And in many cases, that path might never recover to what actually would have happened before. So the impacts of a disaster, not just at the time of the disaster, they can be ongoing. A really good global example of that is in Haiti. I mean, you'll see disasters there that actually really put the country off track. Now, how do we know what that impact is? The gap between pre and post disaster scenarios. Now, we'd suggest that understanding that is really critical for development, because we always talk about building back better, but you can't really build back better until you understand what it is you're building back from. and why did it fall down in the first place? So the idea of building back better is to move that red line, not just back up to the blue line, but actually to exceed it and also make that line more resilient to future disasters. So I just wanted to talk a little about one tool that some of you might be aware of that actually helps in this, and something we're trying to support our Pacific Island country members to implement. It's the post-disaster needs assessment methodology. Now, this is something that's been around in different forms actually since the 70s, but since 2008, it's been used increasingly around the region and around the world. This is examples of PDNAs, post-disaster needs assessments, that have actually taken place around the world, including in the Pacific. So what does it consist of? It's basically looking at analysing the context of the disaster, looking at the disaster effects, the impacts of those effects, and what are the current recovery needs to address those impacts, and how do you put those in a strategy? So it's not just assessing what the impacts are in monetary terms, it's actually looking at them in a way that allows you to formulate a response that addresses those, and in doing so, supports resilience. So I'll quickly go through these. Looking at disaster effects, there's multiple dimensions that we try to look at disaster effects. It's not just damage. We know destruction is one of the things that is often measured very early on in a disaster, but there's loss as well. There's disruption on the production of goods, disruption to governance and decision-making processes at the national and the local level. And there's losses associated with increased risks and vulnerabilities in the time after the disaster event. And in terms of impacts too, that can be looked at in different levels too. There's a macroeconomic impact. So, how we look at the temporary macroeconomic imbalances and declines in different indicators, but also the human impact or the microeconomic impact, looking at disruption of the population's normal livelihoods and income. And it's really a very critical factor, because you can have a disproportionate human impact in a disaster, where you can have some parts of society are relatively untouched and others have profound impacts. And until you look down into those, you identify them, you'll never be able to rebuild better. And similarly with recovery needs, that's looking at resumption of goods and services, of course, but restoration of not just infrastructure, but governance and decision-making processes, and also building in risk reduction into what it is you are building back. So you're building back something that's better because it is more resilient to future risk. So there's been some lessons that have come out of this PDNA process across the world, but also in the Pacific. So we've been really looking at how it's been applied across Pacific Island countries and territories. And Pacific Island countries have learned a lot in this, and there's been some really useful lessons, some things we need to do better, but also some things that can actually be spread around the region as well. So one of SPC's roles is in trying to share lessons amongst our member countries, and that's what we've been doing at the moment, in bringing together countries to actually train on the PDNA process, but particularly focusing on the water sector. So sometimes that process leaves out the water sector. And as we know, as Peter just mentioned about how complex the water sector can be, there's many different players. So ensuring that those different players can actually, and different actors and stakeholders can have a voice in better assessing and understanding the impact of formulating a strategy to build back better is really important. So it's something that we've been pursuing the last year or so, and we're going to keep trying to do that over the next coming years. So, thank you, Sarah, and AWP gang in Canberra. I'll stop my screen sharing now and be back to you.
Thank you, Dave. It's really great to hear about a number of the issues that you raised there around the susceptibility of the Pacific to disaster, and it's a really good reality check actually for us. We're experiencing a little bit of that in Australia at the moment, obviously, but it's becoming more and more frequent in the Pacific, and the impacts are deeper and more multi-sectoral. So thanks for talking us through that. If you stay on the line, we'd love to have you for Q&A a little bit later. And I'll just remind everybody we'll be using Slido for Q&A for this session again. So if you've got questions already, go ahead and put those in. And while Neil's speaking, you can also add questions. So I'll just hand over to Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's good to be here to introduce the new performance management system approach for AWP. It is a bit of a worry to be the last speaker. I know that at that time of the day, a lot of people have other things on their mind, but actually working in M&E and performance, it's often happens that we come up last in the day. So I will try and make it as interesting as I possibly can. So it's appropriate that I'm introducing this proposed new performance management system in the impact session, because the impetus for this reform that AWP is going through is that AWP hasn't been as good as it could be or should be in terms of demonstrating impact, in terms of demonstrating outcomes in country. And that's not a problem that's just AWP's problem. This is a problem across the aid sector, is that difficulty in demonstrating impact. I think within the aid sector in particular, we're very good at talking the talk. There's a lot of good intentions, but often we find it hard to deliver on those intentions. And that's actually been a bit of a theme that I've noticed over the last 2 days, is that there's a recognition that we do need to do things differently if we are to achieve impact. So that's why AWP is going through this reform process. We also realize that eventually that's how we're held to account from our paymasters, from DFAT. And although we've been getting some positive feedback, you never know what's around the corner in terms of the next paymaster when they come and ask us, what are the outcomes? So we need to always be on the front foot in terms of this reform process. So it's a big reform process. And what do you need to do if you're an institution and you want to demonstrate better outcomes? Well, I think it's a change process which is common to most companies or institutions. And I'd argue there's 3 things you need to get right. And the first is you need a good strategy. And by strategy, I mean you need to be able to establish a clear theory of change. You need to be able to identify outcomes, and you need to be able to identify the steps towards the achievement of those outcomes and the time frame. So this goes back to the input, output, outcome theory of change. Secondly, you need to have a good operational system. You need to have, I'd say, a production line. You know, think of it as a conveyor belt. I mean, how can we deliver on these outcomes? How are they going to happen? So this is about the whole management system, the whole HR system, the whole incentives that exist within the institution. And thirdly, and I think it's the hardest thing, and it's a thing that's often neglected, is how do you link the two together? How do you link the strategy, the theory of change, with your operational system, the engine room of the company or institution? I think we've all worked in places where those two things are completely separate. You've got the strategy, performance, M&E people on the one hand, and you've got the people who work in the engine room doing the delivery. and they just don't talk to each other. There's a total disconnect. So what this new approach is trying to do is to bring those two together, to integrate the two processes. So if I start with the strategy, what is the proposed new strategy for AWP? And it's very simple. And the reason it's simple is that from experience, I find that complex strategies don't work. You need to keep things simple. And the very simple strategy for AWP is that through partnerships between Australian partners and in-country partners, we will achieve 3 sets of outcomes. The first set of outcomes is that the in-country partners will acquire new knowledge and skills, useful knowledge and skills in water management. So it's a very simple outcome, the acquiring of knowledge and skills. The second outcome, and which comes from this, is that the in-country partners will apply this knowledge and skills. So it's not just going to sit in their heads, they're going to apply this new knowledge and skills by drafting and piloting and trialling new policies, practices, and tools in water management. So it's the application of the knowledge and skills that they've gained through the partnerships. And thirdly, and most importantly from this, after the trialling and piloting has occurred, the in-country partners are actually going to formally adopt these new policy practices and tools. And following adoption, you get implementation, and from implementation, you get benefits to the communities that we are ultimately trying to assist. So it's a very simple theory of change. And there's 3 words that I'd like you to try to take away from this presentation, and that's acquire, apply, adopt. That's what we do within AWP. If anyone asks you, what does AWP do? You say acquire, apply, adopt policy, practice, and tools which benefit our in-country partners and their communities. But as I said, often the strategy doesn't connect to the operations. How are we actually going to deliver on this agenda? What's the engine room going to look like? So I'm going to keep our engine room very simple. And I'm going to say that AWP production line, we only do 3 things. We produce, to keep the analogy going, we produce 3 types of widgets. And our widgets are projects. And there's going to be 3 types of projects: a tier A project, a tier B, and a tier C. Now, what does a tier A project or activity do? Well, the objective of a tier A activity is to allow our in-country partners to acquire new knowledge and skills. That's it. We want them to acquire the new knowledge and skills. That's how success will be judged for tier A activities. And these activities will be very easy to design, very easy to manage, and easy to report on. A very straightforward way of working. And in fact, this workshop here today, guess what? It's a tier A activity, because the ultimate purpose of this workshop is for you all to acquire new knowledge and skills. That's it. We're not saying you have to go home and adopt those new skills. The ambition we have for this workshop is that you're actually going to learn something new, be it skills or knowledge. And then tier B activities, what are they? Well, tier B activities, the ambition of these activities are that our in-country partners will trial or draft new policies, practices, and tools. And this actually reflects the majority of AWP's current portfolio of activities in countries. That's what they are trying to do. Through the partnerships you have with our in-country partners, the objective is for a transfer of knowledge to occur, which leads to our in-country partners taking the risk and trialling and drafting new ways of doing things. That's what we hope to achieve, and that's how we would measure success for our Tier B activities. Now, these activities will be a bit more complicated, of course. They will be a bit harder to manage and report on because they involve more factors and more issues than a Tier A activity, but still reasonably straightforward. And finally, Tier C. Tier C is activities which we have the ambition will lead to the adoption of new policy, practices and tools by our in-country partners. Now this is sort of the big challenge for us. Can we make that happen? Can we actually, through these partnerships, have a situation where our in-country partners adopt new ways of doing things, implement them, which will lead to changes in development within those countries that will benefit communities at scale. These are complex agendas and will require complex management approaches. It will involve what we've talked about, complex thinking about political economy. It will require a lot of analysis around JEDC as to what's possible and what's not. And it will require very strong partnerships between Australian partners and our in-country partners. And at the moment, AWP probably only has just a small number of activities, which we would say is a Tier C activity, which actually has the ambition and the capability to lead to the adoption of new policy, practices and tools. So, going forward, whenever we have a new activity to consider, the first thing we will ask is it Tier A, Tier B or Tier C? What is the ambition? How will we measure success? Once we've chosen whether it is a Tier A, Tier B or Tier C, we will apply a management system to that activity. And this might be good news, I think, to some of our Australian partners here, because I think you all know that today in Australia, AWP has taken a one-size-fits-all approach to management. So I think you've all had the experience, also at least some of you here have had the experience of filling out an AWP activity completion report. And I know some of you, that was a painful experience because there's a lot of questions in that report which you wondered, why the hell am I being asked that question? That had nothing to do with what I have been doing. So with this tier approach, we're going to have a right fit approach to performance management, where for Tier A, the requirements from you as the reporting partner will be very simple. Tier B, the requirements will be a little bit higher. Tier C, which are where we have the complex management systems and complex ambitions, you'll be asked to do a lot more for us. But you'll also realize that what we ask from you is appropriate to what we're trying to do. You also notice from what I've said, and I hope this has become clear, is that this whole approach, what it's driving at is an integration between our strategy and our operational system. They are going to be one and the same, to the point where our operations, our engine room, the way in which we manage will automatically lead to the achievement of outcomes. We won't even have to think about it because everything will be hardwired to the achievement of in-country outcomes as they relate to the acquiring, the applying, and the adopting of policy practices and tools. So you've got the diagram up here, which tries to represent how we combine the ideas of a strategy with the need for that to be integrated with the operational approach of AWP around the tier system. I'll just make 3 final points, and that is, you can see from, well, firstly, the easiest way to look at the diagram is from the bottom up, where the tier A activities relate to short-term outcomes, which relate to the acquiring of knowledge and skills. Tier B relate to the medium-term outcomes concerning the drafting and trialling of new policy practices and tools. And Tier C relate to the adoption. Now, you also notice that as you move up the diagram, there's a real focus on the strengths of the partnerships that are in place. And the argument here is that we will never achieve the outcomes, the long-term outcomes, unless there are in place trusted and valued partnerships between yourself, the Australian partners, and the in-country partners. And unless we do that better, the chances of success are not as high as they should be. So that will be a very central part of our efforts going forward, is how we can help you build partnerships better with our in-country partners. The second point to make is that GEDSI is fully integrated into this approach. You'll notice for the short-term outcomes, there's a requirement that when we are acquiring knowledge and skills, that GEDSI is incorporated into that knowledge and skills around water management. You'll notice for the medium-term outcomes that it's not good enough just to trial or draft a policy practice or tool. You need to demonstrate how the GEDSI dimension of this challenge is being addressed through this policy practice and tool. And finally, and probably most obviously at the adoption level, we need to be able to show that the implementation of these new policy practices and tool actually benefits the population and the community targeted in an equitable manner, an inclusive manner. And third and finally, you'll see the reference made to the Water Partners for Development community. What do I mean by that? And the community is everyone, all people and institutions who are involved or are engaged with AWP in any way, be it Australian, in-country or international. And in fact, everyone here today is part of that community. And it embraces the concept that we are all in this together in terms of our endeavours to achieve the common cause that we want to achieve, which is to address international water security, particularly within this region. So I'll stop there because there's a lot of content, and this is a subject that could easily could take up a lot more time, and AWP will continue to talk with you all over the coming months as we look to finalise this approach. But I'd hope that people can take away or rest assured that AWP is not sitting back and waiting for things to happen, but it's taking a very forward-looking approach to thinking about how can we do things differently so that we can achieve the outcomes that we need to achieve. And as Jamie Eastbister said at the start of yesterday, that we're not just spinning wheels, we are actually going to deliver. Thank you.